After an unexplained disappearance, a businessman's wife is found living as someone else, with no memory of who she once was. Torn between the luxurious life she forgot and the simple home she learned to love, she finds herself trapped between two worlds. And while everyone waits for a choice, she realizes that the true path may not be returning, but reinventing herself. Before we begin, become part of our family here on the channel. Subscribe now, leave a like, it helps our work so much, and write in the comments which city you're watching from. I love knowing how far our stories travel. The sun had not yet risen when Robert parked his car at the entrance to Englewood once again. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the trunk and took out the roll of posters he had ordered the day before. The same smiling face of Helen stared back at him from each sheet of paper, with those brown eyes he knew by heart, the light brown hair falling over her shoulders, the smile that used to light up any room. Robert had been doing this for 412 days, 412 days since he woke up one Saturday morning and Helen was simply no longer there. The bed still held the warmth of her body, the pillow still had the scent of her hair, but she had vanished as if she had dissolved into thin air. At first, everyone thought she had gone for a morning walk in Lincoln Park, as she often did. Robert even prepared the special breakfast she loved on weekends, with warm cheese scones and freshly squeezed orange juice. But when the clock struck 10 in the morning and Helen hadn't returned, a strange feeling began to grow in his chest. The first private investigator Robert hired said that most missing people return within 48 hours. The second said a week. The third, more experienced, looked Robert in the eye and said frankly that after 6 months, the chances decreased drastically. But Robert refused to listen to statistics. Helen was not a statistic. She was the woman who slept in his arms every night, who hummed while watering the plants on the balcony, who cried while watching butter commercials on television. On that cold July morning, Robert walked through the narrow streets of the neighborhood, putting up more posters. His routine had become mechanical over the months. He would wake up at 5 in the morning, check the WhatsApp groups where he posted Helen's photo, review his emails in the hope of some clue, and go out to cover a different neighborhood of the city. He had already covered the entire south side, the Loop, part of the east side. Now he was in the outskirts, where people paid more attention to the posters, where there was more solidarity among strangers. The walls of his house had turned into an operations center. Maps of Chicago covered the dining room, with colored pins marking where each poster had been placed, where each potential witness had been interviewed. Piles of papers accumulated on the coffee table, reports from investigators, statements from friends, hospital records that Robert obsessively requested. His sister Claire had already suggested 3 times that he seek psychological help. His best friend Brian stopped visiting after Robert accused him of not caring enough. About Helen's disappearance. Robert couldn't understand how people went on with their lives normally, how Brian went back to going out on weekends, how Claire continued to post travel photos on Instagram, how the whole world seemed to have forgotten that Helen existed. For him, time had stopped on that Saturday morning. He still slept on the right side of the bed, leaving the left side free for when she returned. He still bought the gingerbread cookies she loved. He still left the front door unlocked in case she had lost her keys. Robert's company, a construction firm that had thrived for years, now ran on autopilot. He only showed up at the office to sign urgent documents and check for any messages about Helen. His employees whispered in the hallways about the boss who had gone mad with grief. Robert didn't care. Money could be recovered. Helen could not. While putting up a poster on the door of a bakery, Robert felt someone watching him. He turned and saw a girl of about 10 standing on the sidewalk, staring at the photo with wide eyes. She was a thin child with curly hair tied in a ponytail, wearing a school uniform a little too big for her small body. "Mister," she said in a soft but firm voice, "that woman in the picture, she's my mom." Robert's heart raced. For over a year, he had heard hundreds of false leads, people who swore they had seen Helen in different parts of the city, always turning out to be mistakes or attempts to extort money. But there was something in that girl's voice, an innocent certainty that made his legs tremble. "What do you mean, your mum?" Robert asked, crouching down to be at the child's level. "She lives with me and my dad. She came to our house hurt, couldn't remember anything. Dad took care of her, and now she's my mom." The girl spoke with the naturalness of someone talking about what they had for breakfast. Robert felt the world spin around him. Where do you live?" "Just around the corner." "Want me to take you there?" The walk to the house was the longest of Robert's life, even though it only lasted 5 minutes. The girl, who introduced herself as Isabel, chatted about school, about how her new mom made the best flan in the world, about how happy she was not to be alone with her dad anymore. Robert could barely process the words, his blood pounding in his ears. The house was simple, a 2-story building with peeling plaster and a small garden in front. An old motorcycle was parked next to a blue Beetle that Robert didn't recognize. Isabel pushed open the small iron gate and shouted, "Mom, there's a man here who wants to talk to you." When the front door opened, Robert had to lean on the gate to keep from falling. It was Helen, the same Helen who smiled from the posters scattered all over Chicago. The same Helen who danced around the kitchen when she thought he wasn't looking. The same Helen he had searched for on every corner, in every face in the crowd. But she looked at Robert as if he were a complete stranger. "Good afternoon," she said politely. "Isabel said you wanted to speak with me." Robert couldn't speak. He could only look at the face of the woman he loved, searching for some sign of recognition, some familiar glint in her brown eyes. Helen wore simple clothes, a light-colored t-shirt and a denim skirt. She was thinner than he remembered, with slightly tanned skin as if she spent more time in the sun. Her hair was shorter, cut to shoulder length. You don't recognize me," Robert finally managed to whisper. Helen frowned, studying his face intently. "I'm sorry, but should I? Do we know each other from somewhere?" At that moment, a man appeared behind her, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. He was a man in his early 40s, with graying hair, calloused hands, the kind of person Robert would normally only meet when taking his car to the mechanic. The man looked from Robert to Helen with a growing expression of concern. "Is something wrong, Lena?" he asked, using a nickname Robert had never heard. "This gentleman says he knows me," Helen replied, without taking her eyes off Robert's face. Robert felt tears burning behind his eyes. Helen was alive. She was okay. But it was as if the woman he had desperately searched for had died, and a stranger had taken her place. A stranger who answered to the name Lena and called another man when she felt threatened. "My name is Robert Miller," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Helen, you're my wife." The silence that followed was deafening. Isabel looked from one adult to the other, not understanding the tension in the air. The mechanic took a step forward, as if to protect Helen from some danger. And Helen continued to stare at Robert with that confused and slightly frightened expression. "I think you're mistaken," she said gently. "I'm not married. I've lived here with Jacob and Isabel for almost a year. My name is Lena." "No," Robert shook his head vigorously. "Your name is Helen Marie Sanders. You were born on March 12th, 1990. Your favorite color is blue. You have a small scar on your left knee from when you fell off your bike at age 7. You disappeared from our home 412 days ago." Helen instinctively brought her hand to her left knee, and Robert saw a flicker of doubt cross her eyes. "Jacob," she said without looking away from Robert, "I think we should talk inside." The mechanic nodded and stepped aside to let them pass. Robert followed Helen into the simple house, his heart beating as if it would explode. The living room was small, but cozy with old but well-kept furniture, photographs of Isabel scattered on the shelves, and a smell of home-cooked food in the air. Helen sat on the floral print sofa and gestured for Robert to sit in the armchair opposite her. Jacob remained standing, leaning against the wall, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Tell me your side of the story," Helen said, in a voice Robert recognized as the one she used when trying to be patient. And Robert told her. He told her about the morning he woke up and she was gone. He told her about the investigators, the posters, the sleepless nights searching for her. He showed her his wallet, where he carried pictures of the two of them on trips, on their wedding day, on birthdays. He He showed her the wedding ring he wore on his finger and hers, which he carried on a chain around his neck since her disappearance. Helen listened intently, but Robert could see it was the polite attention of someone listening to a stranger's story. There was no recognition, no memory, no love. There was only curiosity and perhaps a little pity. Lena arrived here injured and confused, Jacob finally spoke, his voice low and hoarse. She didn't remember anything, not even her own name. The doctor said she had suffered some head trauma. No one came looking for her, so you kept her here? Robert exploded, feeling a mixture of gratitude and anger. No one kept her, Jacob replied calmly. She chose to stay. When she recovered, I offered to help find her family, but she said she felt at home here. Robert looked at Helen, searching for any sign of the woman he knew. You really don't remember anything? Me? Our home? Our wedding? Helen closed her eyes for a moment as if trying hard to remember. When she opened them again, there was sadness in them. Sometimes I have flashes of places, of faces, but nothing concrete, nothing that makes sense. She paused, looking at Jacob and then at Robert. The life I know is here. Jacob and Isabel are my family. The words hit Robert like punches. He had spent over a year searching for the woman he loved, only to find she had found another family, another life, another love, and worst of all, she seemed happy. Isabel ran into the room, ignoring the tension, and threw herself into Helen's lap. Mum, are you having dinner with us tonight? Dad said he was going to make that pasta you like. Helen hugged the girl with genuine affection, and Robert saw an expression of maternal love on her face that he had never seen before. It was as if Helen had become a different version of herself, a person he didn't know. Of course, sweetie, Helen replied, kissing the top of Isabel's head. Robert stood up abruptly, unable to bear it any longer. His wife was alive, but the woman he loved seemed to have died somewhere, between her disappearance and that moment. And in her place was a stranger named Lena, who loved another child and lived with another man. I have to go, he said, his voice breaking. Helen stood up too, with Isabel still in her arms. Robert, I'm so sorry. I really wish I could remember, but I can't force something that isn't there. Robert nodded, unable to speak. At the door, he turned one last time. If you change your mind, if you remember anything, my number is on the poster. And he left that house with his heart broken in a completely new way. Helen was alive, she was safe, she was happy, but she was no longer his. And Robert had no idea how to deal with this revelation he had wished for so much, and which, at the same time, completely destroyed him. The walk back to the car was a blur. Robert drove through the streets of Chicago with tears streaming down his face, unable to fully process what had just happened. He had found Helen, but he had lost her in a way he never imagined possible. And now he had to figure out if there was still hope of getting back the woman he loved, or if he should learn to accept that she had become someone else, someone who didn't love him back. Robert didn't sleep that night. He sat in the living room armchair, looking at the piles of papers scattered on the coffee table, at the maps on the wall, at all the obsession that had dominated his life for over a year. Helen was alive. That was the miracle he had prayed for every night, but no one had prepared him for the possibility that she would be alive and not remember. Him, that she would be alive and love other people. When the sun rose, Robert already had a plan. If Helen had lost her memory, he would help her recover it. If she didn't remember the love they had, he would make her fall in love with him again. It didn't matter how long it took, it didn't matter what it cost. He had waited 412 days to find her. He could wait a few more months to win her back. The first stop was Helen's mother's house. Sylvia lived in a cozy apartment in the Lakeview neighborhood, and Robert hadn't visited her since the first few months of the disappearance. Their relationship had become strained when she suggested he stop looking and try to move on. At the time, Robert had accused her of giving up on her own daughter. Now, he climbed the building stairs with a heavy heart, knowing he had to swallow his pride. Robert? Sylvia opened the door with an expression of surprise and concern. At 62, She was an older version of Helen, with the same brown eyes and the same delicate way of tilting her head when she was confused. "Did something happen?" "I found her, Sylvia. I found Helen." The older woman leaned against the doorframe as if her legs were about to give out. Robert supported her, guiding her into the apartment. Sylvia sank onto the living room sofa, her hands trembling. "Where? How? Is she okay?" Robert told her the whole story, from the moment Isabel approached him to the conversation in the simple house in Englewood. He saw Sylvia's face go through all the emotions he himself had felt: relief, confusion, pain, hope. "Amnesia," she repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. "And she really doesn't remember anything?" "Nothing. She looked at me like I was a stranger." Robert paused, gathering courage for what came next. "Sylvia, I need your help. You know Helen better than anyone. I need to know how to make her remember." Sylvia stood up and went to a bookshelf filled with photo albums. She took out one of the oldest ones and opened it on the coffee table. The yellowed pages showed Helen as a child, a teenager, a young woman. In every photo, she smiled with that same luminous smile Robert knew so well. "My daughter has always been sensitive to smells and tastes," Sylvia said, running her fingers over a photo of Helen at 15. "When she was a child and was sad, I would make her flan. It was the only thing that calmed her down, and she loved the French perfume her father gave me for our wedding anniversary. She always stole a few sprays when she thought I wasn't looking." Robert mentally noted everything: perfume, flan, childhood memories. Maybe these small things could open a door in Helen's mind. "There's something else," Sylvia continued, her voice lower. "In the last few months before she disappeared, Helen was strange. Quieter, more distant. I asked her several times if everything was okay, but she always said it was just work fatigue." Robert frowned. Helen had never mentioned any problems. On the contrary, they were planning a trip to the Maldives and talking about the possibility of starting a family. What kind of strange? She would cry for no reason sometimes, and she would look at photos from when she was a child, as if she were trying to remember something. Once she asked if I thought she would be a good mother. Sylvia closed the album, carefully. "Robert, are you sure there was nothing going on between you two before she disappeared?" The question bothered Robert more than he wanted to admit. Were there signs he hadn't noticed? Unspoken conversations? Problems he had ignored? "We had some disagreements about children," he finally admitted. "I wanted to wait a few more years to have kids, to focus on expanding the company first. Helen wanted to start trying right away. But that's normal between couples, isn't it? It wasn't something that would make her run away." Sylvia looked at him with an expression Robert couldn't decipher. "Sometimes people carry pains they don't even fully understand themselves." They spent the entire morning organizing a strategy. Sylvia gathered Helen's personal belongings, her favorite perfume, letters she had written as a teenager, the teddy bear she had kept since childhood. Robert photographed the pages of the family albums and wrote down recipes Helen loved. If her memory wouldn't come back naturally, they would help it, along with familiar stimuli. The following afternoon, Robert returned to the house in Englewood. This time he brought gifts: dolls for Isabel, tools for Jacob and for Helen, the French perfume Sylvia had mentioned. Jacob met him at the door with a cautious expression. He was a man of few words, with thick hands from working with engines and a direct way of looking people in the eye. Robert realized he was a few years older than Helen, probably in his late 40s, and had a calmness that contrasted with his own constant anxiety. "Lena is helping Isabel with her homework," Jacob said, not moving from the doorway. "Maybe it's better if you come back another day." "Please," Robert insisted. "I just want to talk to her for a few minutes. I brought some things. That might help her remember." Jacob hesitated, but eventually stepped aside to let him in. The house smelled of home-cooked lunch and cleanliness, a smell of home that made Robert feel a pang of envy. In the living room, Helen was sitting at the table with Isabel, helping the girl with math problems. When she saw Robert, she smiled politely, but he noticed a tension in her shoulders. "Hi, Robert. We weren't expecting you today." "I brought some things for you," he said, handing the package of dolls to Isabel, who squealed with joy and ran off to show them to Jacob. "And this is for you." He extended the small box with the perfume to Helen. She took the small box carefully, as if it was something fragile. "You didn't have to—" "Open it," Robert urged, watching every micro-expression on her face. Helen opened the package and held the glass bottle between her fingers. It was the same perfume she wore when they met 10 years ago at a mutual friend's graduation party. Robert remembered the first time he smelled that scent, how he had felt dizzy when she walked past him on the dance floor. "It's beautiful," Helen said, spraying a little on her wrist and smelling it. For a moment, Robert saw something flash in her eyes, a flicker, a doubt, an almost memory, but it only lasted a few seconds. "You used to love this perfume," Robert said carefully. "You wore it whenever we went out to dinner." Helen smelled her wrist again, closing her eyes. "It's familiar, but I can't say why." It was a start. Small, but it was something. "Helen," Robert approached her at the table. "Would you like to go out with me tomorrow just to talk, to get to know the situation better? I could take you to lunch somewhere you used to frequent." Helen's expression tightened slightly. "Robert, I understand this must be very difficult for you, but you need to understand that my life is here now, with Jacob and Isabel." "I'm not asking you to abandon anything," Robert hurried to say. "I just want a chance to talk, to maybe help you remember a few things. Just one afternoon." Jacob entered the room at that moment, with Isabel beside him playing with the new dolls. "Lena," he said, "the decision is yours, but maybe it's better if you don't. Go alone with him." The protectiveness in Jacob's voice irritated Robert. "I'm not a danger to her, I'm her husband." "You're the husband of the woman she used to be," Jacob replied calmly. "The Lena I know might not want to relive a past she doesn't remember." "Stop, both of you." Helen raised her voice for the first time since Robert had found her. "I can speak for myself." She looked from one man to the other, visibly uncomfortable with the tension. "Robert, I'll have lunch with you tomorrow, but Jacob will drive me there and pick me up. It's that or nothing." Robert wanted to protest, but he realized it was better to accept her terms than to risk losing the opportunity completely. "All right. What time?" "Noon, but I have to be back by 3. Isabel has tutoring, and I always take her." They agreed to meet at the South Gardens Mall, a neutral place where Robert hoped Helen would feel safe. When he left the house, he had a mix of hope and apprehension in his chest. A whole afternoon with Helen. Maybe it would be enough time to start breaking down the barriers that amnesia had built. That night, Robert prepared as if it were the first date of his life. He chose the blue shirt Helen always said brought out his eyes, the men's cologne she had given him for his last birthday. He planned every detail of what he would say, every story he would tell, every memory he would share. The next morning he arrived at the mall half an hour early and waited in the parking lot. When he saw Jacob pull up in the Blue Beetle and Helen get out of the car, his heart raced. She wore a simple cotton dress and flat sandals. Her hair was in a loose bun and she was more beautiful than ever. But there was something different about her, a tranquility Robert didn't remember seeing before. "Hi," she said, approaching him with a shy smile. "Hi. You look beautiful." Helen blushed slightly. "Thank you. Where are we having lunch?" Robert took her to an Italian restaurant on the second floor of the mall, the same kind of place they used to go in the early years of their marriage. While they waited for the food, he told stories about how they met, about the first trip they took together, about the day he proposed to her on a beach in Key West. Helen listened intently, asking questions about details, trying to fit the information with the few fragments of memory she had. Every now and then, Robert saw a look of concentration on her face, as if she were straining to remember. "And what was our routine like?" she asked, poking at the pasta on her plate. "How did we spend our weekends?" Robert smiled, encouraged by her interest. "You loved visiting the Chicago Botanic Garden on Saturday mornings. You said the plants helped you. Relax. And we always went to the movies on Sunday afternoons. You cried in every movie, even the romantic comedies." "I really cried at the movies. Always. And you'd get mad when I laughed at how sensitive you were." Robert laughed at his own story. "Once you cried so much watching Marley and Me that we had to leave the theatre before the movie ended." Helen laughed too, and for a moment Robert felt like it was old times again. "It sounds like I was quite dramatic." "You were intense," Robert said, choosing his words carefully. "You felt everything very deeply. It was one of the things I loved most about you." Helen's smile faded a little. "And you? What were you like with me?" The question caught Robert off guard. He had always seen himself as a good husband, attentive and caring, but for the first time he tried to think about how Helen saw him. "I took care of you. I worked hard so you could have everything you wanted. I always wanted you to be happy." But was I happy? Robert paused, his forkful of food halfway to his mouth. It was a simple question, but it made him think about things he had never considered. Helen smiled in photos, participated in the activities he planned, never complained about their routine. But did that mean she was happy? "I thought so," he said honestly. "You never said you weren't." Helen nodded, but Robert could tell the answer hadn't fully satisfied her. They finished lunch talking about lighter topics, but the question lingered in the air like a cloud. When Jacob arrived to pick Helen up, Robert felt as if he had taken a test and wasn't sure if he had passed. Helen said goodbye with a kiss on his cheek, thanked him for lunch, and said maybe they could see each other again next week. "Helen," Robert called before she got in the car, "you may not remember me now, but I want you to know that I love you. I always have. And I'll wait as long as it takes for you to remember that too." She looked at him for a long moment, and Robert saw something like sadness in her eyes. "Robert, I don't want you to wait for something that may never happen." And she got into the car, leaving Robert alone in the parking lot, with the feeling that he had won a battle but was still very far from winning the war. That night, Robert called Sylvia and told her about the lunch. She listened in silence and then asked a question that made him even more uneasy. "Robert, are you sure you really want to get back the Helen she was before? Or are you trying to get back the version of her that existed in your head?" The question echoed in Robert's mind for hours. He wanted Helen back, of course. But which Helen? The one who smiled in photos but maybe wasn't completely happy? The one who agreed to everything but never expressed her own desires? Or a new, different Helen, one he didn't even know yet? For the first time since finding his wife, Robert wondered if maybe the amnesia wasn't just trauma. Maybe it had been an escape, and if it was, what did that say about the marriage he thought was perfect? These questions haunted him until dawn, when he decided that the answers didn't matter. What mattered was that Helen was alive, she was well, and he would do anything to have her back, even if it meant discovering truths about himself that he preferred not to know. The week passed slowly for Robert, each day filled with anticipation and anxiety. He had arranged to see Helen again the following Saturday, but this time he wanted to do something different. Instead of just telling stories about the past, he wanted to show her the places that had been important to them. Perhaps being physically in the locations where they had built memories could awaken something in her mind that words alone could not. On Thursday night, Robert received a call that would change everything. "Robert, it's Sylvia." Sylvia's voice was trembling, filled with emotion. "I need to see Helen. I can't wait any longer. She's my daughter, Robert. My little girl." Robert perfectly understood the desperation in her voice. Since Monday, when he told her about the reunion, Sylvia had called every day wanting details, asking how Helen was, if she had mentioned her mother, if there was any sign that she remembered her family. The weight was consuming her as much as it had consumed Robert all that time. "Of course, Sylvia. We'll go together on Saturday. Maybe seeing you will spark something in her. Do you think she'll recognize me?" The question came laden with a fragile hope that broke Robert's heart. "I don't know. But she needs to meet you, regardless of her memory. You're her mother." On Saturday morning, Robert picked up Sylvia from her house. The woman was visibly nervous, wringing her hands and checking her reflection in the car's rearview mirror every 5 minutes. "What if she doesn't want to see me? What if I scare her? Robert, it's been over a year since she disappeared from my life. What if finding out I exist makes her even more confused?" Robert drove slowly through the streets of Englewood, trying to reassure Sylvia and himself. She has a right to know who you are, and you have a right to see your daughter. When they pulled up in front of the simple house, Robert saw Jacob working under the hood of a motorcycle in the makeshift garage next to the residence. The mechanic looked up, wiped his hands on a rag, and approached the car with a cautious expression. "Robert, I didn't know you were bringing someone else today. Jacob, this is Sylvia Sanders, Helen's mother." The impact of the information was visible on Jacob's face. He looked from Robert to Sylvia, processing the implications of the visit. "Her mother," he repeated, as if testing the words. "May I see my daughter, please?" Sylvia got out of the car with dignity, but Robert could see the tremor in her legs. Jacob nodded and led them to the house. On the way, he explained that Helen had gone out with Isabel to buy ingredients for Sunday lunch, a tradition they had developed over the past few months. They should be back soon. Sitting in the small but cozy living room, Sylvia looked around, trying to find traces of her daughter in the environment. On the coffee table was a picture of Helen with Isabel at the park, both smiling genuinely. On the bookshelf, some books Robert knew Helen liked to read. On the wall, drawings Isabel had made that Helen had lovingly taped up. "She seems happy here," Sylvia murmured, more to herself than to the others. "She is," Jacob replied, with a softness in his voice Robert hadn't heard before. "Lena brought light into this house, for me and especially for Isabel. The girl never had a mother figure. And Lena, she just fit into the role as if she were born for it." Jacob's words bothered Robert more than he wanted to admit. Helen had never shown such a strong maternal instinct when they were married. They had talked about children, of course, but always in an abstract way, as something they would do one day. Robert had always thought Helen was in no hurry, that she also preferred to wait, but maybe he had been wrong. Maybe she was just respecting his pace. The sound of a key in the lock interrupted his thoughts. Helen walked in, carrying grocery bags, with Isabel chattering beside her about which dessert they were going to make. When she saw Robert, she smiled with the polite cordiality he already knew. But when her eyes fixed on Sylvia, Helen stopped completely. "Lena?" Jacob stood up, sensing the sudden tension. "Are you okay?" Helen was staring at Sylvia as if she had seen a ghost. She dropped the bags on the floor, and Isabel quickly began to pick up the fruit that had rolled out. I know you," Helen said, her voice almost a whisper. Sylvia stood up slowly, tears already streaming down her face. "Helen, my daughter. Mum." The word came out of Helen's mouth automatically, like a reflex, and then she began to cry. Robert felt a mixture of relief and jealousy. Helen had recognized her mother, however vaguely. Her memory wasn't completely lost. But why had she recognized Sylvia and not him? Mother and daughter hugged in the middle of the room, both crying, while Isabel looked on confused, and Jacob remained tense, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional situation. "I dream about you sometimes," Helen said, still in her mother's arms. An older woman, making flan in the kitchen, humming a song I can't quite remember. "You are my sunshine," Sylvia whispered. "I always sang You Are My Sunshine while I cooked. You used to say it was your favorite song when you were little." Helen pulled back a little to look at her mother's face. "Why do I remember you and not—" She looked at Robert. "And not him?" "A mother's love is different," Sylvia said, stroking her daughter's face. "It comes from a deeper, more primitive place. Even when the mind forgets, the heart sometimes still knows." Robert felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. If a mother's love was unforgettable, what did that say about the love he and Helen had shared? They spent the rest of the morning talking, Sylvia telling stories from Helen's childhood, showing old photos she had brought. Helen listened with a hungry attention, as if each story were a piece of a puzzle she was trying to fit together. "You were always stubborn," Sylvia laughed, showing a photo of Helen at 5, arms crossed and face scowling. "Once, you decided you would only wear red dresses for a whole month. No matter what I said, you wouldn't budge." "And did it work?" Helen asked, smiling. "I bought 7 different red dresses because I couldn't stand the daily argument anymore." Helen laughed, and Robert realized it was the first time he had heard her laugh since the reunion. It was the same crystal-clear laugh he knew, but there was something lighter about it now, more spontaneous. Jacob had discreetly retreated to the kitchen with Isabel, giving the family reunion some privacy. Robert could hear them talking softly, Isabel asking questions he couldn't quite make out. "Helen," Sylvia said, becoming more serious, "I want you to know that I never stopped looking for you. Robert too, we never gave up on you." Helen looked from her mother to Robert, and for the first time since the reunion, he saw something like guilt in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she said, "for causing so much pain. I don't remember what happened, but I know you suffered because of me." "You have nothing to apologize for," Robert hurried to say. "What matters is that you're okay, that you're safe. But I'm not the same person, am I? The Helen you knew. She kind of died, didn't she?" The silence that followed was heavy. It was a question no one wanted to answer, but everyone had thought. "You're my daughter," Sylvia said finally. "With or without your memory, you will always be my daughter. And I want to get to know who you are now, not just remember who you were." Helen smiled through her tears. "I'd like to get to know you too, to know my own story." It was then that she suggested something no one expected. What if I tried to split my time? Spend a few days with you, a few days here? Maybe that way I can understand who I was and who I am now. The proposal caught everyone by surprise. Robert felt a wave of hope, but also apprehension. Jacob returned from the kitchen at that moment, having clearly overheard the conversation. "Lena, are you sure about this?" he asked with genuine concern in his voice. "I have to try, Jacob. They're my blood family. I have a right to know them, and they have a right to know the person I've become." Isabel appeared behind Jacob, hugging his waist. "Is Mommy Lena leaving?" she asked in a small, frightened voice. Helen knelt in front of the girl and took her little hands in hers. "I'm not leaving, my dear, but I'm going to spend a few days with these people, who are my family, just like you and Daddy are my family. But you'll come back. I'll always come back to you, Isa, I promise." Isabel didn't seem completely convinced, but she nodded. Robert saw in the girl's face the same fear he felt, the fear of losing Helen to the other side. They arranged for Helen to spend the next 2 weeks alternating between the two homes. 3 days at Robert's mansion, 3 days at Jacob's house, 1 day with Sylvia, and 1 day for her to decide where she wanted to be. It was a strange, almost bizarre schedule, but it was better than nothing. The following Monday, Robert went to pick up Helen to take her to the mansion where they had lived together for 5 years. During the drive, he pointed out familiar places, the restaurant where they had their first date, the bookstore where she spent hours on Saturdays, the hospital where she was born. When they arrived at the house, Robert saw Helen look at the imposing facade with an expression he couldn't decipher. Was it admiration? Intimidation? Nostalgia? "It's big," was all she said. The house was indeed impressive. 3 stories, a swimming pool, a garden with over 20 different types of flowers. Robert had bought it with the future in mind, the children they would have, the parties they would throw. Now it seemed excessive for 2 people who were getting to know each other again. Inside the house, everything was exactly as Helen had left it. Robert hadn't touched anything in her room, her closet, the beauty products in the bathroom. It was like a shrine to a person who had disappeared. Helen walked through the rooms like a stranger visiting someone else's house. She touched objects here and there, looked at photos on the walls, but nothing seemed to spark a significant memory. In the bedroom, she opened the closet and ran her fingers over the hanging clothes. Did I wear these clothes? "You loved that blue dress," Robert said, pointing to a dress she had worn on their last wedding anniversary. "You said it brought out your eyes?" Helen took the dress off the hanger and held it against her body, looking at herself in the mirror. "It's beautiful, elegant, but it doesn't feel like me." Robert felt a pang of sadness. The expensive clothes, the designer shoes, the jewelry he had given her over the years. It all seemed foreign to the Helen of now, who wore simple dresses and flat sandals. On the first day, Robert tried to recreate the routine they used to have. He took Helen for breakfast at the French restaurant she loved, for a walk in the Chicago Botanic Garden, for lunch at the club they frequented. In each place he told stories, showed photos, tried to spark some connection. At the Botanic Garden, Helen stopped in front of a flowering yellow trumpet tree. "I know this tree," she said, touching the trunk. Robert got excited. "You used to come here every week. You said it was your favorite place in Chicago." Helen closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "It smells familiar, and I have the feeling I've sat under this shade before." "You did. You would bring a book and stay here for hours. Sometimes I'd come to pick you up, and you wouldn't even notice I'd arrived. You were so engrossed in your reading." But even with these flashes of familiarity, Helen didn't seem emotionally connected to the places. It was as if she recognized the scenery from a movie she had watched a long time ago, but couldn't remember the story. At night, in the king-size bed they had shared for 5 years, Helen slept on the left side, leaving a respectful space between them. Robert lay awake watching her silhouette in the darkness, so physically close and so emotionally distant. On the second day, Helen asked to see photo albums. They spent the entire afternoon in the living room, Robert narrating each image, their honeymoon in the Caribbean, Christmases with family, birthdays, weekend trips. Helen paid attention to every detail, asking questions about the people in the photos, about the places they visited. "I looked happy in these photos," she observed, looking at an image from her last birthday 2 months before she disappeared. "You were happy," Robert replied automatically, but the statement sounded false, even to himself. Helen looked at him with that investigative expression he was learning to fear. "How do you know? Did you actually ask if I was happy, or did you just assume I was?" The question disconcerted him. You never said you weren't." "But did I say I was?" Robert thought for a long moment. Helen had always been a reserved person with her feelings. She smiled, participated in the activities he planned, agreed with the decisions he made. But when was the last time she had verbalized happiness? When was the last time she had initiated a conversation about how she felt? "You weren't one to talk much about feelings," he finally admitted, "and you didn't ask." It wasn't a question, it was a statement, and Robert realized it was true. So on the third day, Helen was quieter, more thoughtful. At dinner, she picked up her fork but didn't eat anything. "Robert," she said without looking at him, "I want to be honest with you." His heart raced. "About what?" "About all of this. About this attempt to get our life back." Helen looked up and Robert saw determination in her eyes. "I don't feel anything. I don't feel love. I don't feel a connection. I don't feel longing. I look at these photos and see 2 people who seem happy, but I don't remember being that woman. And more importantly, I'm not sure I want to be her again." Robert felt as if the floor had opened up beneath him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe the Helen you knew really did die, and maybe that's not necessarily a tragedy." The silence stretched between them like an abyss. Robert wanted to protest, to argue, to convince her she was wrong, but there was a truth in her voice that he couldn't contest. "And Lena?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Do you love them?" Helen thought for a long moment. "I feel at home with them. I feel like I can be who I really am, without having to perform or try to remember how to be someone I'm no longer. Isabel calls me Mum, and my heart fills with love. Jacob looks at me as if I'm enough, exactly as I am. Here," she looked around the luxurious room, "here I feel like an actress trying to play a role I've forgotten how to perform." Robert closed his eyes, trying to process the pain of her words. "And there's nothing I can do? No way to win you back?" "Robert," Helen said, her voice softer now, "you're not trying to win me back. You're trying to resurrect a woman who no longer exists, and that's not fair to me, to you, or to the person I've become." That night, Robert slept in the guest room and Helen in the master bedroom. The next day, she packed her bags and returned to Jacob's house. But before she left, she made a proposal that would change everything. "I want to keep visiting you both. I want to get to know my mother. I want to know about my history. But as Lena, not as Helen. If you can accept the person I am now, instead of trying to turn me back into the person I was before, maybe we can build a new relationship. Robert stood at the entrance of the house, watching Jacob's car drive away. Helen had made her choice clear. She wasn't going back to the life they had. But maybe, just maybe, he could find a place in her new life. That afternoon, alone in the mansion that suddenly seemed haunted by empty memories, Robert walked through the rooms, trying to understand what had happened. He stopped in the office where he spent most of his time before Helen's disappearance, looking at the desk covered with company papers, the computer that never turned off, the phone that rang at all hours. He tried to remember the last meaningful conversation he had had with Helen. Not about bills or social engagements, but a real conversation about feelings, about dreams, about fears. He couldn't. He realized, with a tightness in his chest, that in the last years of their marriage, they had become two polite strangers sharing the same space. He went up to the bedroom and opened Helen's closet again. This time he didn't just see expensive clothes and elegant accessories. He saw uniforms for a life she might not have chosen, costumes for a personality she might have created to satisfy his expectations and those of the society they lived in. Robert picked up his phone and called Brian, his best friend, for the first time in almost 2 years. "Robert? Man, I thought you didn't want to talk to me anymore." "Brian, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." "Of course, go ahead." "Helen, before she disappeared, did she seem happy to you?" The silence on the other end of the line was revealing. Brian was a psychologist, had a keen eye for human behavior, and had been friends with the couple since the beginning of their relationship. "Robert," Brian said finally, "do you really want to hear the answer?" "I need to hear it." "Helen always seemed like a woman who was trying to be perfect for you. She agreed with everything, always smiled, never questioned your decisions. But happiness isn't the absence of conflict. It's authenticity. And I didn't see authenticity in the Helen of the last few years." Brian's words confirmed the fears Robert had been avoiding. Helen had been the perfect wife because she had suppressed who she really was. And now that she had found an authentic version of herself, she didn't want to go back to the performance. "What do I do, Brian?" "Get to know the person she is now. And ask yourself if you can love her for who she really is, not for who you wanted her to be." Robert hung up the phone with more questions than answers, but for the first time since the reunion, he began to understand that maybe the problem wasn't Helen's memory loss. Maybe the problem was that she had finally found herself. The question that now tormented him was more complex than he had imagined. Could he accept Lena as she was, or would he remain forever in love with the ghost of Helen? And more importantly, did he have the right to try to influence her choice, knowing that on the other side there was a child who loved her as a mother, and a man who accepted her exactly as she was? These questions would echo in his mind for a long time, as he tried to figure out if true love meant fighting for someone, or letting that person be free to choose their own happiness. The following 2 weeks were a period of trial and adjustment for everyone involved. Helen maintained her routine of alternating between the houses, but Robert noticed she was increasingly uncomfortable in the mansion. She politely participated in the activities he planned, answered questions about the past, but there was a growing distance between them that no effort seemed to be able to bridge. Sylvia, on the other hand, was flourishing in her renewed relationship with her daughter. Helen visited her mother every Thursday, and they spent hours cooking together, listening to old music, flipping through family albums. The connection between them was genuine and strengthened with each meeting. Sylvia had quickly accepted that her daughter was now a different person, and instead of trying to recover the past, she was building a new relationship in the present. "Helen taught me how to make a chocolate cake she learned from Jacob today," Sylvia told Robert one Thursday afternoon when he came to pick her up. "It's different from the recipe I used to make for her as a child, but it's delicious. She's happy, Robert, truly happy." Robert listened to these stories with a mixture of joy and sadness. He was happy to know Helen was well, but it hurt to realize that this happiness didn't include him. Worse still, he was beginning to accept that perhaps it never had. On Friday morning of the second week, Robert decided to try a different approach. Instead of taking Helen to places they used to frequent together, He wanted to show her spaces in the house that might awaken deeper, more intimate memories. "Helen," he said during breakfast, "there's a room in the house you haven't seen since you came back." She looked up from her plate, curious. "Which one?" Robert hesitated. It was a risk, but perhaps a necessary one. "The room we prepared for our future child." Helen's expression subtly changed. It wasn't recognition, but something akin to unease. "Did we have a child?" "No. But we were trying. And you had started preparing a room in case—" Robert didn't finish the sentence. He guided Helen down the second-floor hallway to a door that had remained closed for over a year. When he opened it, a smell of must and dust greeted them. The room was exactly as Helen had left it. Walls painted a pale yellow, a wooden crib in the center, a nursing chair in the corner, shelves with children's books and stuffed animals. Helen entered slowly, as if treading on sacred ground. She ran her fingers over the crib, picked up a teddy bear that was on the nightstand. "I decorated this?" she asked, her voice lower than usual. "You spent weeks choosing every detail. You wanted it to be perfect, neutral, because we wanted it to be a surprise whether it was a boy or a girl." Helen sat in the nursing chair and closed her eyes. Robert saw a look of concentration on her face, as if she were straining to remember. Her hands moved instinctively to her belly, a gesture he recognized from the time of her pregnancy. "Robert," she said, her voice trembling, "I feel something strange in here, like a longing for something I don't know what it is. What happened to our baby?" The question Robert had feared since he decided to show her the room. He knew he would have to tell her eventually, but he still didn't feel ready to relive those terrible days. "You lost the baby. In the 4th month of pregnancy, it was very hard for you, for both of us." Helen slowly opened her eyes and looked directly at him, as if she could read the truth written on his face. "When?" "3 weeks before you disappeared." Helen ran her fingers over the arms of the chair, feeling the texture of the soft fabric she had specifically chosen for late-night rocking. "What was it like?" I remember pain. A lot of pain. And you telling me everything was going to be okay." Robert approached slowly, as if she were a wounded animal that might be startled. "It was on a Monday morning. We were about to leave for the doctor, for the routine ultrasound. You were excited. You wanted to find out if we could see the baby's gender yet. But when you got out of bed, there was blood," Helen completed, her voice almost a whisper. "A lot of blood." "Yes. I rushed you to the hospital. You were terrified, saying you had done something wrong, that maybe you had worked too much, that maybe you shouldn't have carried those heavy books. To organize the baby's library." Helen got up from the chair and walked to the crib, running her hands over the wooden bars. "And the doctor said it wasn't my fault." "He did. He explained that these things happen, that the fetus wasn't developing properly, that there was nothing you could have done differently." Robert paused, remembering his own pain from that day. "You blamed yourself for weeks." The silence that followed was heavy with a painful understanding. The pieces of the puzzle finally fit together. Helen's unexplained sadness in the last few weeks, the emotional distance, the sudden crying spells Sylvia had mentioned. "I remember," Helen whispered, her hands on her belly. "Not clearly, but I remember the pain, physical and emotional. I remember being in this room, looking at the empty crib, and feeling like the world had ended." Robert moved closer to her, wanting to comfort her, but Helen held up a hand for him to stop. "How did you react when we lost the baby?" she asked. The question caught Robert off guard. I was sad too, of course, but I tried to be strong for you." "No." Helen shook her head. "How did you really react?" Robert tried to remember those terrible days. Helen had lost the baby on a Monday morning. They were getting ready to go to the doctor for the routine ultrasound when she started bleeding. At the hospital, the doctor confirmed what they both already knew. There was no longer a heartbeat. "I said we could try again," Robert admitted finally. "I said you were young, that we would have other opportunities. I tried to make you look to the future instead of being stuck on what we had lost." Helen looked at him with an expression he couldn't decipher. "And when I said I didn't want to try again so soon, that I needed time to process the loss." Robert felt a tightness in his chest. He remembered that conversation, but at the time he had interpreted Helen's hesitation as natural fear, something that would pass with time. I said the longer we waited, the harder it would be, that the best medicine for sadness would be a new pregnancy. And when I tried to talk about my feelings, about how empty I felt, about how I was afraid something was wrong with me, each question was like a stab. Robert remembered now with painful clarity how he had downplayed Helen's feelings, how he had tried to rush her healing, how he had become impatient with what he considered excessive melancholy. "I thought I was helping," he said, his voice broken. "I thought if you didn't dwell on it." "You didn't let me feel," Helen completed. "You didn't let me process the loss of our child. And when I needed you most, you were worried about moving on." Robert sat on the floor of the nursery, his legs weak. "Helen, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand. And that's why I left," she said, more to herself than to him. "Not consciously, perhaps, but something in me needed to escape from a place where my pain wasn't valid, where my feelings didn't matter." They were silent for several minutes, surrounded by the remnants of a dream that never came true, and that may have been the beginning of the end of their marriage. "Robert," Helen said, finally getting up from the chair, "I need to leave. I need to go home." "This is your home," Robert protested weakly. "No, home is where we are accepted as we are, where our feelings are respected, where we are loved, not just when we are convenient." Helen looked around the room one last time. "This was the home of the Helen you wanted me to be, not the person I really am." Robert followed her to the master bedroom, where Helen quickly packed her bags. She only took the clothes she had brought from Jacob's house, leaving behind all the expensive pieces from her old wardrobe. "Please," Robert pleaded, "don't go like this. We can talk, we can try to understand better. Robert, you spent 3 days trying to convince me to be someone I'm no longer. And now that we've discovered why I needed to leave the first time, you still want me to stay." Helen closed the suitcase firmly. "I can't live in a relationship where my authenticity is seen as a problem to be solved." When they arrived at the house in Englewood, Isabel ran to hug Helen as if she had been away for months instead of just 3 days. Jacob was in the garage, as always, but Robert noticed he was visibly relieved to see Helen back. "Daddy, Mommy Lena is back. She brought us back. The dolls that Uncle Robert gave her," Isabel shouted, pulling Helen by the hand into the house. Robert watched the scene with a heavy heart. The ease with which Helen fit into that family dynamic, the genuine smile that appeared on her face when she was with these people, the way her shoulders relaxed as soon as she stepped into that simple house. Jacob approached, wiping his hands on a rag as always. "Everything okay?" he asked, looking from Helen to Robert. "It is now," Helen replied, and Robert knew it was true. She really was better here, with them. "Jacob," Robert said, gathering the courage for a conversation he had been postponing for weeks, "can we talk? Alone?" The two men walked to the small makeshift workshop in the garage. Amidst old tools and motorcycle parts, they finally had the conversation they both knew was necessary. The smell of oil and metal contrasted with the emotional intensity of the moment. Robert watched Jacob arranging some wrenches on the workbench, noticing that the man's movements were a way of dealing with nervousness. "Do you love her?" Robert asked directly without beating around the bush. Jacob stopped organizing the tools and looked directly into Robert's eyes. "Yes, deeply." "For how long?" "Since the first day she smiled at Isabel. Since I saw how she took care of my daughter when she couldn't even remember who she was." Jacob leaned against the workbench, choosing his words carefully. "You know, Robert, when Lena arrived here, she was broken. Not just from the amnesia, but there was a deep sadness in her, as if some part of her soul had been wounded long before the accident." Robert swallowed hard. "What kind of sadness?" "The kind that comes when someone has spent too long pretending to be something they're not. She would cry in her sleep sometimes, and she would talk in her sleep about feeling empty, about not knowing who she really was." Jacob wiped his hands on the rag, a habit Robert had noticed he had when he was thoughtful. But gradually, living here, being simply accepted for who she was, that sadness went away. She blossomed, like a plant that finally got the right light. Robert felt a tightness in his chest. And you never tried to take advantage of her vulnerability? Never. The answer came quickly and firmly. I offered her shelter, care, respect. I never pushed for anything. When I realized I was falling in love, I was very careful not to influence her decisions. Isabel needed a mother figure, and Lena naturally took on that role. My feelings came later, as a consequence of what I saw. A generous, caring, authentic woman. And does she feel the same? Jacob looked through the dirty garage window, where they could see Helen playing with Isabel in the small yard. The afternoon sun created a golden halo around them. Honestly, I don't know. She cares for me, that's clear. She looks after me when I'm sick, smiles when I come home after a hard day, shows affection in many small, meaningful ways. And she loves Isabel as if she were her own blood. He paused, running a hand through his graying hair. But if it's romantic love, only she can say that. And I've never asked directly because I don't want to pressure her. Robert admired the man's honesty and patience. How can you live with that uncertainty? Because what we have is already more than I ever dreamed of having in life. Isabel is happy. She has a mother who loves her. I have a partner who brings peace and joy to our home. If one day she decides she wants something more or something different, I'll respect that. I won't try to hold her back. If she chooses to stay with you, will you accept that maybe part of her heart will always belong to the past she lost? The question surprised Jacob. It was generous and painful at the same time, coming from the man who was losing the woman he loved. Robert, if she chooses to stay with me, it will be because she wants to. Be here in the present, building something new. The past she lost includes pain, trauma, a version of herself that may never have been completely happy. If some part of her heart still carries love for who you were to her, I accept that. But I won't compete with ghosts, and you shouldn't either. Robert realized he had learned more about relationships in the last 10 minutes with Jacob than in years of marriage. You're a better man than I am, he admitted. I'm not better. I just learned that true love isn't possession, it's freedom. Lena taught me that. When they returned to the house, they found Helen in the kitchen preparing dinner with Isabel. It was a simple domestic scene, but it radiated a peace that Robert had never experienced in his luxurious mansion. Robert, Helen called, would you like to have dinner with us? It was an invitation laden with symbolism. Robert accepted, and for the first time, he sat at the simple kitchen table as a guest in Helen's new life, not as someone trying to claim ownership over her. During dinner, Isabel talked about school, about the drawings she was making to decorate her and Mommy Lena's room. Jacob talked about an old car he was restoring. Helen shared stories of her visits to her mother, the recipes she was learning, the books she was reading. Robert realized that for the first time since the reunion, he was truly getting to know who Helen had become. Not the Helen he remembered, not the Helen he wanted to recover, but Lena, a woman who had found joy in simple things, who had discovered a maternal love she might never have known she had, who had learned to express her feelings without fear of judgment. After dinner, while Helen put Isabel to bed, Robert and Jacob sat in the small living room, drinking coffee and talking about football, work, everyday life. It was strange, but Robert felt more relaxed in that house than he had in months. When Helen came down after putting Isabel to bed, she sat on the sofa between the two men and made an announcement no one expected. I want you both to know that I've made a decision about how I want to organize my life from now on. Robert's heart raced. This was the moment he had both feared and anticipated. I want to continue living here, with Jacob and Isabel. This is my home, this is my family. She looked at Robert before continuing. But I also want to maintain a relationship with you and my mother. Not as an ex-husband and ex-wife trying to recreate the past, but as people who care about each other and share a history. Robert tried to process what she was saying. It wasn't the reconciliation he had hoped for, but it also wasn't the complete severing he had feared. What does that mean exactly? He asked. It means you will always be welcome here. It means I want you to get to know the person I am now. And I want to get to know the person you can be when you're not trying to recover something that's already gone. Helen paused, looking into his eyes. It means we're going to try to build a new way of relating to each other based on who we are today, not who we were yesterday. Jacob had been quiet throughout her statement, but Robert saw an expression of peace and acceptance on his face. And us? Robert asked, gesturing vaguely between himself and Helen. There is no us in a romantic sense anymore, Helen said, gently but firmly. That part of our story ended when the Helen you knew disappeared. But there can be a new kind of connection, if you're willing to accept it. Robert felt tears burning behind his eyes. It wasn't what he had dreamed of during all those months of searching, but maybe it was better than losing Helen completely. And you? He asked Jacob. How do you feel about all this? Jacob looked at Helen with so much love in his eyes that Robert felt a pang of both envy and admiration. Lena is a free woman to make her own choices, Jacob said. If she chooses to divide her time and affection among several people who love her, I can only feel lucky to be one of them. Helen smiled and took Jacob's hand, and Robert saw in that simple gesture more intimacy and connection than he and Helen had shared in the last years of their marriage. Robert, Helen said, you need to decide if you can accept this. If you can love me as a friend, as family, without expecting me to become your wife again, because I'm not going back. Robert looked around the simple room, at the woman he had loved and lost, at the man who had found and welcomed her, at the photos of a little girl who now called Helen Mom. It was so different from everything he had planned for his life. But there was an authenticity here that his previous life had never had. Can I come visit sometimes? Get to know who you are as a family better? Always, Helen replied without hesitation. But only if you promise you won't try to change me, won't try to convince me to come back, won't compete with what we've built here. Robert took a deep breath. It was a generous offer considering everything that had happened. He could continue to be a part of Helen's life, even if in a completely different way than he had imagined. I accept, he said, and for the first time in months he felt at peace with the decision. That night, Robert returned to his empty mansion with a heart that was broken, but also, in a way, healed. Helen was alive. She was happy. She was safe. And maybe, just maybe, they could build something new on the ruins of what had been lost. He hadn't gotten his wife back, but perhaps he had gained something even more valuable, the chance to truly know the person Helen had become and to discover who he himself could be when he stopped living in the past and started accepting the present. 6 months had passed since that decisive night at the house in Englewood, and life had found a new rhythm for everyone involved. Robert had sold the mansion on the south side and moved into a smaller, cozier apartment in Lakeview near Sylvia. The decision had surprised everyone, including himself, but it made sense in a way he was still learning to understand. It was a sunny Saturday morning when Robert parked his car in front of the familiar house he now knew by heart. Over the past few months, these visits had become part of his routine. No longer as the desperate husband trying to reclaim his lost wife, but as someone genuinely interested in being part of the daily life of the people Helen now called family. Jacob greeted him at the door with a nod, his hands already greasy even though it was only 9 in the morning. "Robert, you're early today. Lena and Isabel are still making pancakes." It was impressive how the relationship between the two men had evolved. What began as territorial tension had transformed into a genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and a shared love for Helen and Isabel. Robert had learned a lot about mechanics in recent months, helping Jacob with old car restorations on weekends. In return, he had helped Jacob organize the finances of the small garage and even brought in some new clients through his business contacts. "What are you restoring today?" Robert asked, following Jacob to the garage. "That 1978 Beetle that came in last week. The owner wants to surprise his daughter who's graduating from college." Jacob uncovered a light blue car with its engine completely disassembled. "Want to take a look? Your hands are cleaner than mine." Robert smiled and rolled up his shirt sleeves. There was something therapeutic about working with his hands, fixing something broken and seeing it come back to life. It was very different from the abstract work of construction he had done for years. "Daddy, Uncle Robert!" Isabel came running from the kitchen, her mouth smeared with jam and a radiant smile. In recent months she had started calling Robert Uncle naturally, without anyone suggesting it. For Robert, that simple title meant more than any business contract he had ever signed. "Hi, Princess. How are the pancakes? Mommy Lena said you can eat with us, but you have to wash your hands first because they're dirty from the car." Robert laughed. Mommy Lena is right, as always. Finding Helen in the kitchen still brought a pang of emotion to Robert, but it was a different emotion now. No longer the desperate pain of loss, but something more like gratitude. Gratitude that she was well, that she was happy, that he could be part of that happiness in a new way. "Good morning, Robert," Helen said, turning from the stove with a spatula in her hand. She wore a floral apron Sylvia had given her and had flour on her nose. "I hope you're hungry because Isabel insisted on making pancakes for an army." "I'm always hungry for your pancakes," Robert replied, and realized it was true. The homemade food Helen prepared had a taste of home he had never experienced before. During breakfast, Isabel talked about the science project she was doing for school on the water cycle. Helen spoke about the culinary course she had started at a nearby technical school, a dream she had only recently discovered. Jacob commented on the garage, which was doing so well that he was considering hiring an assistant. "And you, Robert?" Helen asked, stacking another pancake on his plate. "How are things at work?" Robert had drastically reduced his hours at the company, delegating more responsibilities to his team and focusing only on the projects that truly interested him. "Actually, I have some news. I've decided to start a new project." He told them about the idea he had been developing for weeks, using his experience in construction to develop quality affordable housing in peripheral neighborhoods. It was a project that combined social responsibility with economic viability, something that gave real purpose to his work. "That's amazing, Robert," Helen said, her eyes shining with genuine enthusiasm. "You've always been good at building beautiful things. Now you'll be building beautiful things that also make a difference in people's lives." It was the kind of support Robert had never received from her during their marriage, and he realized it was because now she truly saw him for who he was, not as the idealized version of a successful husband he had tried to be before. After breakfast, while Jacob went back to the garage and Isabel went out to play with the neighbors, Robert and Helen stayed in the kitchen washing dishes together. It was a simple activity they had developed over the months, a moment of quiet conversation that always brought them closer. "Robert," Helen said, drying a plate, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you happy? I mean, with your life as it is now?" It was a question she asked from time to time, and Robert knew it came from a place of genuine concern. Helen felt responsible for having destroyed the life he had planned, even though he had explained many times that she had, in fact, freed him from a life that wasn't truly his. "I'm happier than I ever imagined I could be after losing you," Robert answered honestly. "Not in the way I expected, not in the way I planned, but yes, I am happy." Helen smiled, and Robert saw in that smile a peace she had never shown during their marriage. "Sometimes I feel guilty for being so happy too, as if I don't have the right, after everything that happened." "Helen!" Robert stopped washing dishes and turned to look at her directly. "You deserve all the happiness in the world, and what we have now is better than what we had before. It's real." At that moment, Sylvia arrived for Sunday lunch, a tradition that had naturally established itself over the past few months. She always brought a homemade dessert and stories about her building's neighbors that amused everyone. "Robert, dear," she greeted, kissing his cheek. "How's our social entrepreneur?" Sylvia had adapted to the new family setup with a wisdom and generosity that impressed everyone. She treated Robert like a son, Jacob like a dear son-in-law, and Isabel like the granddaughter she never had. For her, family wasn't defined by documents or traditions, but by love and presence. During lunch, prepared by 6 hands in the small kitchen, they talked about their plans for the week. Isabel had a presentation at school on Thursday and wanted everyone to be there. Helen had scheduled a meeting with the culinary course coordinator to discuss the possibility of doing an internship at a restaurant. Jacob was excited because last week's beetle was ready and the owner was coming to pick it up on Monday. "And next Saturday," Sylvia announced, "I want everyone to come to my apartment. I'm going to make that lasagna Helen loved as a child. I want to see if she still likes it." It was impressive how Sylvia managed to create moments of connection between Helen's past and present without forcing memories or creating pressure. She had intuitively understood that her daughter's new life didn't erase her previous history, but it also didn't need to be limited by it. After lunch, while the adults drank coffee in the small living room, Isabel brought out a photo album she was putting together herself. They were recent photos from the last 6 months, showing the evolution of the family they had built. Robert appeared in many of them, helping Jacob in the garage, playing with Isabel in the park, talking with Helen in the kitchen, laughing with Sylvia during Sunday lunches. "Look at this one, Uncle Robert." Isabel pointed to a photo where Robert was teaching her how to use a wrench, both with concentrated expressions. "Mommy Lena said you didn't know anything about mechanics when you got here, but now you can change a tire all by yourself." Robert laughed, remembering how clumsy he was with tools at first. "It's true. Daddy Jacob is a very patient teacher." "And look at this one." Isabel turned the page, showing a photo from Helen's birthday party the previous month. Robert had organized a simple surprise in the backyard, with Christmas lights strung on the crabapple tree and a cake Sylvia had made. Helen was in the photo, laughing, surrounded by the people she loved, with an expression of pure happiness that Robert had never seen during their years of marriage. "That's my favorite picture," Helen said, taking the album, "because it shows how love can take many different forms." Robert looked at the photo again and realized she was right. There were 5 people who loved each other in completely different ways. The maternal love between Helen and Isabel, the discreet but deep romantic love between Helen and Jacob, the renewed filial love between Helen and Sylvia, the loyal friendship that had grown between Robert and Jacob, and the transformed but true love that still existed between Robert and Helen. "Robert," Jacob said, "I have a proposal for you." Everyone looked at him, curious. Jacob wasn't one for dramatic announcements. "The garage is growing, and I need someone to handle the administrative side, someone who understands business, who knows how to deal with suppliers, who can help me expand in an organized way." He paused, looking at Robert. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a partnership. You'd come in with capital and business knowledge. I'd bring the technical expertise and established clientele." Robert was surprised. It was a completely unexpected proposal, but it made sense in a way he hadn't considered before. "Are you sure about this, Jacob?" "Absolutely. I've already talked to Lena about it. She thinks it would be great for us to work together officially, instead of you just helping me informally on weekends." Helen nodded, smiling. "I think you two would make a great team, and it would be good for Isabel to have you around more often during the week." Robert looked around the table at these people who had become his family in a way he had never imagined. Jacob's proposal represented more than a business opportunity. It was an invitation to integrate even more deeply into the life they were building together. "I accept," he said, extending his hand to Jacob. "But on one condition." "What's that?" "I want part of the profits to be set aside for a fund for Isabel, for college, for her dreams, for whatever she wants to do in the future." Jacob shook his hand firmly, and Robert saw tears in the eyes of the man who had become much more than a brother-in-law or business partner. He was truly a brother. Isabel jumped from her chair and hugged Robert tightly. "Now you're going to work with Daddy every day, and you can pick me up from school when they're busy?" "If your mommy and Daddy let me, yes." "Of course," Helen said, her voice filled with emotion. "You're already part of our routine anyway. Now it'll just be official." That afternoon, after Sylvia had left and Isabel had gone to play at a friend's house, Robert, Helen, and Jacob sat in the small backyard to discuss the details of the partnership. But the conversation soon drifted to more personal matters. "Robert," Helen said, "I've been thinking a lot about what you asked me a few months ago, about whether I could be happy knowing I caused so much suffering." Robert remembered the question. It was during one of his first visits after Helen's decision, when he was still processing the pain of their final separation. And what was your conclusion? That suffering is a part of life. What matters is what we do with it. Helen looked at Jacob, then at Robert. You could have become bitter. You could have tried to force me to come back. You could have made our coexistence impossible. But you chose to grow, you chose to transform, you chose to build something new. Robert thought about the past few months, about how he had changed, not just externally, but internally. I didn't have much of a choice. You all taught me that true love isn't possession. And you taught us that it's possible to start over without erasing the past, Jacob completed. When night fell, Robert said his goodbyes with the feeling that his life had finally found its right place. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was the life he was meant to live. On his way home, he stopped at the cemetery where there was a small memorial for the baby Helen had lost. It was a place he visited occasionally, not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. Gratitude that this loss had eventually led Helen to discover who she really was, and him to discover who he could become. Thank you, he whispered to the small headstone, for teaching us that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what really matters. 3 months later, the Jacob and Robert Restorations and Mechanics Garage was fully operational. Robert had discovered a passion for classic cars he never knew he had, and Jacob had learned about business management in a way he never imagined possible. Helen had secured an internship at a renowned restaurant and was considering starting a small homemade food business. Isabel had gotten excellent grades in school and constantly talked about wanting to be a mechanical engineer like Daddy and Uncle Robert. In December, almost a year after the reunion, they threw a Christmas party at the house in Englewood. Sylvia brought friends from her building. Jacob invited some fellow mechanics. Helen called friends from her culinary course, and Robert brought some employees from his construction company who had become personal friends. Isabel invited half her school. It was a noisy, joyful party, full of people who knew each other in different ways but mixed together naturally. Robert watched it all from a corner of the yard, marveling at the human capacity to create family where there is love. Lost in thought? Helen approached, offering him a glass of punch. Thinking about how life is funny. 2 years ago, I thought I knew exactly what my future would be. Big house, thriving company, perfect wife, kids in the best schools. Robert laughed at himself. And now I look at all this and realize I've never been happier. Helen watched him for a moment. Can I ask you a personal question? Of course. Do you still love me? Romantically, I mean. The question caught him by surprise, but Robert realized the answer was simpler than he expected. I love the woman you were, I always will, but that woman doesn't exist anymore. And the woman you are now, I admire, respect, and love as family, but not romantically. Is that strange? No, Helen smiled. It's healthy. It's real. And you? Do you know how you feel about Jacob yet? Helen looked inside the house where Jacob was trying to teach some friends how to play dominoes, while Isabel helped by giving contradictory advice to all the players. I do. I love him. In a way I never knew was possible. She paused. Do you know what the difference is? What? With him I don't have to be perfect. I can be entirely myself with all my flaws, all my complications, all the messiness of being human. And he loves me exactly for that, not in spite of it. Robert nodded, understanding perfectly. That's what I've learned too. True love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone imperfect who is perfectly compatible with our own imperfections. They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the party, listening to the laughter, feeling the genuine joy that hung in the air. Robert, Helen said finally, thank you. For what? For not giving up on me, but also for learning when to stop fighting who I've become, for letting me go and, at the same time, finding a way to stay. Robert smiled, feeling a deep peace settle in his chest. Thank you for teaching me that sometimes losing what we think we want is the only way to find what we truly need. That night, after everyone had left and the house was tidied up, Robert said goodbye to the family as he always did, with a kiss on Helen's cheek, a hug for Jacob, and a kiss on Isabel's forehead, who always insisted on staying up until he left. See you tomorrow, Uncle Robert, she said, sleepy but smiling. See you tomorrow, Princess. And Robert knew there were many tomorrows ahead, full of possibilities he had never imagined, but which were more beautiful and true than any plan he had ever made. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Robert, Helen, Jacob, and Isabel has deeply touched your hearts. If you were moved by this journey about the true meaning of love, about accepting loss, and discovering that sometimes it leads us to even more beautiful places than we imagined, please leave a like below. Subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments which moment of the story marked you the most. Was it the reunion through the innocent eyes of little Isabel? The painful but liberating discovery about the lost baby? Or perhaps the transformation of Robert, who learned that to truly love means to let the person be free to be who they really are? Every day we bring intense stories like this one, exploring the deepest corners of the human soul, speaking of second chances, of family formed by love and not just by blood, of how it's possible to rebuild life on the rubble of dreams that didn't come true. We'll meet here again tomorrow, with another story that will stir your emotions and make you reflect on your own relationships and choices. We'll be waiting for you.